The stench of desperation and cheap ale clung to the air in the auction house, a cloying perfume of ruin. Elara stood on the raised wooden block, a piece of property catalogued and numbered. Below her, a sea of faces swam in the smoky torchlight, leering, assessing. Indifferent, they were not buying a person, they were buying a solution to a problem. Her problem was that she existed. Theirs was a need for cheap labor, a warm body, a debt settled. Her father stood near the back, his face a mask of false piety and sorrow. Beside him, her sister Lyra wore a smirk that was far more honest. This was their triumph. Elara, the quiet one, the one whose spirit they had tried and failed to break for years, was finally being excised from their lives like a troublesome splinter. The debt was real, a shadow that had long haunted their house, but the choice to settle it with her flesh and bone was a cruelty honed by years of jealousy. She was instructed to weep. A tearful Omega fetched a higher price, a sign of a pliable, broken nature. But Elara's eyes were dry. Her spine was a rod of iron beneath the thin, scratchy linen of her shift. She would not give them the satisfaction. She lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping over the crowd with a coolness she did not feel. Inside, a cold, hard knot of terror was lodged beneath her ribs, but on the outside, she was marble. She would not break. Not for them. He saw her from the shadows near the far wall, a place where the grime and the gloom conspired to make a man forgettable. King Theron, ruler of the vast and unforgiving north, stood cloaked in the guise of a commoner. His clothes were the drab brown of turned earth, his hands calloused from years of gripping a sword hilt. Not from labor. No one gave him a second glance. He was just another shadow in a room full of them. For 2 centuries, Theron had existed in a world without color or warmth. A witch's dying curse had encased his heart in ice, leaving him adrift in a silent, grey sea of numbness. He felt no joy, no sorrow, no rage. There was only a profound, unending emptiness. A cold that had nothing to do with the perpetual winter of his lands. He was a king who could not feel the loyalty of his subjects, a warrior who could not feel the thrill of battle, a man who could not feel the sun on his skin. He had come to this sordid place on the last desperate whim of his royal healer, who had mumbled something about a shock to the system. He had expected nothing. He always expected nothing. Then he saw the girl on the block. He saw the defiance in the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes that burned against the humiliation of her circumstance, and in the frozen wasteland of his soul, something stirred. A flicker, a tiny, impossible pinprick of feeling, sharp and unfamiliar. It was not warmth, it was interest. The auctioneer began his spiel, his voice slick with practiced charm. He described Elara's virtues, her strong hands, her healthy teeth, her supposed docility. The word was so absurdly wrong that Theron almost smiled. There was nothing docile about the silent fury radiating from her small frame. She was a cornered wolf, not a lamb for slaughter. The bidding began, low and insulting. A farmer offered a few copper pieces. A portly merchant raised it to a silver crown, his eyes crawling over her with a possessive hunger that made Theron's hands clench into fists at his sides. He felt the ghost of an emotion then, a cold, sharp thing that might have been anger. It was another flicker in the dark, and it was aimed squarely at the merchant. Elara's gaze met his for a fleeting second across the crowded room. She saw only a quiet, plainly dressed man, his face obscured by shadow. She dismissed him instantly. He was of no consequence, likely a stable hand or a mercenary down on his luck, here to gawk at the misery of others. She turned her attention back to the merchant, her expression hardening into one of pure disdain. The price crept upward, a miserable, sluggish climb. Each bid was another stone laid on Elara's chest. She focused on her breathing, on the solid feel of the block beneath her bare feet. She would not faint. She would not scream. Then a new voice cut through the din. It was not loud, but it possessed a strange and absolute authority that silenced the room. 1,000 gold sovereigns. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Heads swiveled, searching for the source. The voice had come from the shadows by the far wall. The quiet man stepped forward, just enough for the torchlight to catch the hard planes of his face. He looked unremarkable, yet the air around him seemed to crackle with an unseen power. The auctioneer gaped, his jaw working silently. 1,000 gold sovereigns was a king's ransom, enough to buy the entire building, the entire street. It was an impossible sum for a man dressed in wool and worn leather. Sold, the auctioneer stammered, slamming his gavel down with a trembling hand to the gentleman in brown. Theron's eyes locked with Elara's. He saw shock, confusion, and a healthy dose of suspicion in their depths. He had just bought her, body and soul. He had done it not as a king making a decree, but as a man making a choice. And for the first time in centuries, he felt the weight of a decision. He had felt the flicker, and now he had to see if he could coax it into a flame. The journey began in a carriage that was as plain and unremarkable as its owner. It was sturdy, clean, but utterly devoid of any comfort or embellishment. The wooden bench was hard, the leather squabs worn smooth. Elara sat opposite the man who now owned her, a maelstrom of fear and fury churning within her. He had not said a single word to her since leaving the auction house. He had simply paid the coin, signed a crude mark on the bill of sale, and gestured for her to follow. His silence was a wall, thick and impenetrable. It unnerved her more than threats or lewd comments would have. It gave her nothing to fight against, no weakness to exploit. She decided she would have to build a target herself, just to have something to aim at. "You paid a fortune for me," she said, her voice sharp and clear in the rattling confines of the carriage. "I hope you know you've been swindled. I'm a terrible cook, and even worse at mending, and I have no intention of warming your bed." The man did not react. His gaze was fixed on the passing landscape, a blur of green fields and grey sky. His profile was stark, all harsh angles and shadows. He looked carved from stone. His stillness was infuriating. It was a dismissal. After a lifetime of being overlooked and ignored, she would not tolerate it from the man who had just purchased her very freedom. "Are you deaf?" she pressed, leaning forward slightly. "Or just witless? Did you spend all your coin on me and forget to purchase a personality?" Inside Theron, her words were not insults. They were stones tossed into a frozen lake, sending sharp cracks across the surface. Each syllable was a spark of her fire, and he found himself leaning into it, desperate for its heat. He had forgotten the sound of a voice that was not weighed down by fear or protocol. It was fascinating. He remained silent, wanting to see what she would do next. "You look," she continued, her eyes narrowing as she took in his drab tunic and scuffed boots, "like someone's forgotten stable hand. The one they send to muck out the stalls no one else will touch. Did you steal the money?" He finally turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. They were grey, the colour of a winter storm over the sea. They were old, ancient even, and held a profound emptiness that momentarily silenced her. There was no anger in them, no lust, just a quiet, unnerving intensity. An observation. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The single, silent gesture was more frustrating than any shouted retort. She slumped back against the hard seat, crossing her arms over her chest. "Fine, be a mute, I don't care, but we're travelling north. I despise the cold." The corner of his mouth twitched. It was the barest hint of a movement, so fleeting she thought she might have imagined it. The irony was lost on her, but not on him. She despised the cold, and he was the living embodiment of it. For 3 days, they travelled in this manner. Elara filled the silence with a constant stream of insults, observations, and demands. She complained about the quality of the bread he bought at coaching inns. She mocked the simple blanket he offered her at night. She told him his manners were appalling, and that he had the conversational skills of a turnip. And through it all, Theron listened. He felt the ice around his heart begin to thaw, not in a great melt, but in tiny, agonizing drips. Her voice, sharp and defiant, was the only thing that had ever pierced the suffocating stillness of his curse. He found himself anticipating her barbs, hoarding them like treasures. She was alive in a way he had forgotten was possible. She was fire and fury and life, and he was a man made of frost, drawn to her warmth. He never defended himself. He never corrected her. He simply watched her, his grey eyes following her every move. He was a scholar studying a rare and beautiful text, committing every line to memory. On the evening of the 3rd day, the landscape began to change. The rolling green hills gave way to rugged, pine-choked mountains that clawed at the sky. The air grew colder, sharper. Elara pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her stream of complaints finally drying up as a sense of dread settled over her. This was the north, the unforgiving wild lands of the Alpha King. They rounded a bend, and she saw it. Nestled in a valley carved from the very mountain it stood upon was a fortress of breathtaking scale. It was all black stone and soaring towers, banners snapping in the wind. The capital, the citadel of a king she had only heard of in terrifying whispers. King Theron, the Winter King. A ruthless, immortal warrior who had ruled for centuries, whose heart was said to be made of ice. The carriage did not stop at the city gates. It continued up the winding road toward the citadel itself. Elara's heart began to hammer against her ribs. "Where are you taking me?" She whispered, her earlier bravado gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear. "You can't, you're not a servant of the king, are you?" The man finally spoke. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, like stones grinding together deep within the earth. "No," he said, his grey eyes fixed on the approaching fortress. "I am not his servant." They reached the main gate, a massive structure of iron and obsidian. The guards, clad in black steel armor that gleamed like polished ice, snapped to attention. Their fists slammed against their breastplates in a resounding salute. They did not look at the carriage. They looked at the man sitting opposite her. "Your Majesty," the captain of the guard boomed, his voice echoing in the stone archway. The world tilted on its axis. Elara stared at the man beside her, at his plain brown tunic and his calloused hands. She looked at the worshipful, fearful expression on the guard's face. She looked back at the man, at the storm-grey eyes that now held a trace of something she couldn't name. It might have been regret. He was not someone's forgotten stable hand. He was the king. He was King Theron, the Alpha King, the Winter King. And for 3 days, she had done nothing but insult him. The blood drained from her face. The cold knot of terror in her stomach burst, flooding her with an icy dread that was absolute. She was going to die. The citadel was a monument to silence and cold. Vast halls of polished black marble echoed with the solitary click of their footsteps. There were no tapestries on the walls, no rushes on the floor, no roaring fires in the colossal hearths. The air was still and frigid, carrying the scent of stone and winter. It was less a home than a tomb. Elara walked beside him, her body rigid with terror. She expected to be dragged to the dungeons at any moment. Every guard they passed slammed a fist to their chest, their eyes downcast. A gesture of profound fear and respect directed at the man in the simple brown tunic. The king. Her buyer. Her tormentor-to-be. He led her not to a cell, but to a wing of the castle that seemed marginally less desolate. He stopped before a set of carved oak doors and pushed one open. "These will be your chambers," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. She stared into the room. It was larger than the entire cottage she had grown up in. A massive bed with dark furs, a fireplace that was, to her surprise, lit and crackling with a small, hesitant fire, and a wardrobe carved from dark wood. It was an honor guard's chamber, not a prison cell. This was somehow more terrifying. She finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Why?" Theron turned to face her. In the dim light of the corridor, his face was a mask of shadows. "You will be safe here." Safe? The word was a bitter laugh on her tongue. "I have spent the last 3 days insulting the most powerful man on the continent. How could I possibly be safe?" She braced herself for the anger, the cold fury she had been expecting. It never came. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. "You were honest," he said, as if that explained everything. "No one has been honest with me in a century." With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the long, empty hall, leaving her alone in the doorway of her gilded cage. Days bled into one another. Elara was a ghost in the cold heart of the citadel. Servants, silent and skittish, brought her food and laid out fine clothes of wool and velvet, which she refused to wear, preferring her simple linen shift. It was the last piece of herself she owned. She saw the king only occasionally. A glimpse of him crossing a courtyard, a fleeting sight of him standing on a high balcony, staring out at his frozen kingdom. He never summoned her. He never approached her. He just existed, a silent, powerful presence at the center of this cold, dead place. The fear began to recede, replaced by a profound and suffocating confusion. What did he want from her? Why this strange, hands-off imprisonment? The uncertainty was a torment in itself. One evening, unable to bear the silence of her chambers any longer, she went in search of him. She found him in the royal library, a cavernous room filled with shelves that stretched up into the darkness. A single candle burned on a massive oak table, illuminating his profile as he stared at a book, though she could tell he was not reading it. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, gathering her courage. He did not seem to notice her. He was utterly still, a statue of a king. The loneliness radiating from him was a physical force, a cold wave that washed over her. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice small in the vast space. He looked up. His grey eyes showed no surprise. It was as if he had been waiting for her. He gestured to the chair opposite him. She walked slowly, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, and sat. The table between them felt as wide as a chasm. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the flutter of the candle flame. Elara looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time without the lens of fear or anger. She saw the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the rigid set of his jaw, the profound emptiness that seemed to hollow him out from the inside. He was not just a king. He was a man drowning in silence. Her own pain had taught her to recognize the suffering of others. She had intended to apologize, to beg for her life. But the words that came out were not the ones she had rehearsed. They were direct, honest, and born of a sudden, startling flash of empathy. "Why are you like this?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. He stiffened slightly. "Like what?" "So, empty," she said, searching for the right word. "The way you stand, the way you watch things. It is like you are separated from the world by a sheet of ice. Even now, by this candle, you seem cold. No one had ever dared. No one had ever asked. His court, his generals, his subjects, they all walked on eggshells around his moods, which were not moods at all but varying degrees of a vast, frozen nothingness. They interpreted his silence as displeasure, his stillness as rage. They had never seen it for what it was, a prison. Her question, so simple and so fearless, was the key that turned a lock he had forgotten existed. He looked at her, at this girl he had bought at a squalid auction, this fierce, defiant creature who had insulted him for days and now sat across from him, demanding the truth of his soul. And he broke a silence he had held for 200 years. "I am cursed," he said. The words felt foreign on his tongue, heavy and rusted with disuse. He watched her face for any sign of fear or revulsion. He saw only a quiet, focused attention. "Centuries ago," he began, his voice a low monotone, "my ancestor executed a forest witch. With her dying breath, she cursed our bloodline. She did not wish us death, but something she considered worse. She cursed us to feel nothing, to be encased in ice from within, to rule without joy, to fight without passion, to live without love." He gestured vaguely at the grand empty room. "This castle is not cold because of the climate, Elara. It is cold because of me. My curse leaches the warmth from everything it touches. Stone, wood, people. I have not felt the warmth of the sun, the heat of a fire, or the touch of another person since the day I took the throne." He finally looked down at his own hands resting on the table. "I exist, I rule, I command, but I do not live. I am a ghost in my own body, a king in a kingdom of ash and silence." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Elara thought of her own life, of the coldness of her father's ambition and her sister's hate. She understood isolation. She understood what it was to be surrounded by people, but to be utterly, terribly alone. She did not offer pity. Pity was a useless, condescending emotion. Instead, she offered the one thing she had in abundance: understanding. "It must be very lonely," she said softly. His head snapped up, his grey eyes wide with a flicker of something she had never seen before. Surprise raw, unshielded surprise. Of all the reactions he might have imagined, fear, disbelief, ambition, he had never considered simple empathy. The sheer weight of her quiet understanding struck him with the force of a physical blow. "I went to that auction," he continued, his voice rougher now, the controls slipping, "because I was desperate. I thought that perhaps, if I saw the worst of the world, the rawest of emotions, something might break through. Greed, cruelty, despair, anything. And then I saw you." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw the man behind the king. "You stood there, facing it all, and you did not break. You had more fire in your little finger than anyone I had met in my entire life. When you looked at me, when you spoke to me in the carriage, your anger, your spirit, it was the first thing I have truly felt in over a century. It was like a spark in the dark, like a single note of music in an eternity of silence." He fell silent, the confession leaving him exposed, his defenses stripped away. He had given her a weapon that could destroy him. He waited for her to use it. Elara simply nodded, absorbing his truth. Her own fear was gone, burned away by the heat of his painful honesty. She was no longer a prisoner, and he was no longer a king. They were just two lonely souls, sitting in a cold, dark room, sharing the truth of their scars. If you are enjoying this story, please like this video to let me know you'd like to see more content like this. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic between them shifted. The vast, cold castle became their shared space, and the silence, once oppressive, became comfortable. Elara, no longer his prisoner but not yet his equal, found a strange new purpose. She began, tentatively at first, to bring life back into the citadel. She ordered the servants, who were slowly beginning to see her not as a captive but as a strange new fixture of the court, to open the heavy draperies, letting dusty shafts of sunlight pierce the gloom. She found a book of legends in the library and, one evening, she began to read it aloud to Theron. He would sit in his chair, utterly still, his eyes closed, and just listen. Her voice filled the emptiness of the library, painting pictures of heroes and monsters, of sun-drenched lands and magical seas. For Theron it was more than a story. It was warmth. It was color. It was a lifeline thrown across the frozen expanse of his existence. Lord Valerius, the king's chief adviser, watched this transformation with a cold, disapproving eye. He was a man carved from the same stone as the castle, old and unyielding. He saw Elara not as a salvation, but as a dangerous anomaly. A king's strength, in his view, came from his detachment, from the very coldness that defined Theron. This girl, with her stories and her sunlight, was a threat to the established order. "Your Majesty," he said one afternoon, finding the king in the council chamber, staring out a newly cleaned window. "The court is unsettled. This, Omega, her presence is an impropriety. She has no title, no lineage. She distracts you from your duties." "She does not distract me, Valerius," Theron replied, his voice even. "She reminds me that I have them." It was the most emotion Valerius had heard from him in 50 years, and it disturbed him deeply. The true turning point came on a particularly cold night. A fierce wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. Elara found Theron in the library, huddled in his chair, a fine tremor running through his powerful frame. He was wrapped in a thick fur cloak, but his skin was pale, his lips tinged with blue. "The curse is worse on nights like this," he said, his teeth chattering slightly. "The cold, it settles deeper." Elara looked at the roaring fire in the hearth, a blaze she had insisted upon. Its heat seemed to stop a few feet from his chair, unable to penetrate the aura of profound cold that surrounded him. He was shivering in front of a furnace. Her heart ached for him. It was an instinct, pure and simple. She moved toward him, her steps hesitant. She knelt before his chair and, without thinking, reached out and took his hand. The shock of it was brutal. His hand was not just cool, it was unnaturally, deathly cold, like marble pulled from a frozen tomb. Her own warmth was instantly leached away, and she gasped, but she did not let go. Theron flinched at her touch, his eyes flying open. No one had touched him with such simple, unsolicited kindness in his entire life. He had forgotten the sensation of another's skin against his own. Through the layers of icy numbness, a new sensation pierced through. A tiny, miraculous pinprick of warmth, originating from where her small, soft hand engulfed his. It was a revelation, a miracle. Hope, a dangerous and terrifying emotion, bloomed in his chest for the first time. It was a fragile, tender green shoot pushing its way up through a glacier. "Elara," he breathed, his voice filled with a wonder that was almost painful. She held his hand tighter, pouring her own life, her own warmth, into him. "I am here," she whispered. But the curse was a jealous, sentient thing. It had held dominion over his soul for centuries, and it would not relinquish its prize so easily. The intrusion of hope, of warmth, of connection, it was a declaration of war, and the curse answered. That night, Theron was ripped from sleep by a pain so intense it stole the air from his lungs. It was a cold that did not just chill, but burned. It was a fire made of ice, consuming him from the inside out. He cried out, a raw, agonized sound that echoed through the silent stone of the castle. Elara was at his side in an instant, her heart pounding. She found him writhing on his bed, his skin covered in a sheen of frost. The very air in the room was frigid, her breath pluming in front of her face. Delicate, deadly patterns of ice were creeping across the stone walls, branching out from the bed like frozen veins. "Theron!" She cried, rushing to him. He was convulsing, His eyes squeezed shut in agony. It's fighting back, he ground out through clenched teeth. The hope, it's making it stronger. It's trying to snuff it out. The hope she had given him was now the fuel for his destruction. The fragile warmth they had shared had enraged the ancient cold, and it was now accelerating, intent on freezing him solid, turning him into the ice statue he had always felt he was. The curse was no longer content to numb him. It was actively trying to kill him. The citadel was thrown into chaos. Healers were summoned, but they were useless, retreating from the supernatural cold that radiated from the king's chambers. Lord Valerius seized the opportunity, his voice ringing with authority in the panicked halls. "This is her doing," he declared to the assembled court lords and guards, pointing a trembling finger at Elara, who refused to leave Theron's side. "The Omega Witch. She has poisoned the king with her strange magic. Seize her." The guards hesitated, their loyalty to the king warring with their fear and Valerius's influence. Theron's breathing was growing shallow, his movements weaker. The frost on his skin was thickening, turning into a brittle, crystalline shell. He was dying. He was losing. Elara looked at his face, contorted in a pain he was finally, horribly able to feel. She saw the man who had listened to her stories, the man who had confessed his deepest wound to her, the man whose soul had called to hers from across a crowded room. A fierce, protective rage surged through her, a fire hotter than any she had ever known. She would not let him go. As she clutched his freezing hand, her eyes blazing, Valerius made his move. He drew a small, dark object from his robes, a shard of obsidian, pulsing with a malevolent cold light. "The witch gave this to my ancestor," he hissed. "A key to focus the curse's power. For generations, my family has ensured the king remains, strong, unfeeling. He will not be undone by a slip of a girl." He lunged not at Theron, but at Elara, the shard held like a dagger. He knew she was the source of the warmth, the source of the hope. To kill the king, he first had to extinguish the flame. Time seemed to slow. As Valerius lunged, something deep within Elara, something ancient and primal, awoke. It was the core of her Omega nature, a power not of submission but of creation. It was the fire of life itself, a wellspring of warmth and light that had lain dormant until this very moment. It was her love for Theron, made manifest. She was faced with a choice that was no choice at all. She could turn this newfound power outward, a weapon to strike Valerius down. Vengeance was a tempting, fiery path. Or she could turn it inward, pouring every last ounce of her being into the man she loved, a desperate gamble to save him from the encroaching dark. She chose love. Ignoring Valerius, she focused all her will, all her love, all her fire on Theron. She held his hand with both of hers, closed her eyes and pushed. A wave of pure, golden light erupted from her, a silent explosion of warmth that filled the room. It was not the heat of a fire, but the heat of a sunrise, the warmth of a beating heart, the heat of life itself. The frost on the walls evaporated instantly. The icy shell on Theron's skin cracked, then shattered into a million glittering fragments, dissolving into steam. The obsidian shard in Valerius's hand glowed white-hot, and he screamed, dropping it as it burned his flesh. The wave of light pulsed, centered on where Elara held Theron's hand. She felt a deep, resonant crack, not in the room but deep within him. It was the sound of a glacier carving, of a prison of ice a century thick finally breaking apart. Theron arched his back, a great shuddering gasp tearing from his lungs. It was not a gasp of pain, but of release, of life. Color flooded his skin, the healthy flush of blood, the warmth of vitality. He opened his eyes, and they were no longer the grey of a winter storm. They were clear, bright, and filled with 1,000 emotions at once. The curse was broken. The first thing Theron felt was the warmth of Elara's hands. It was a staggering, overwhelming sensation, a flood of pure life that brought tears to his eyes. After 2 centuries of profound sensory deprivation, the simple feeling of her touch was the most beautiful thing he had ever known. He sat up, his body feeling light, alive, his own for the first time. He could feel the soft furs beneath him, the warmth of the air on his skin, the frantic, joyful beating of his own heart. And when he looked at Elara, he felt a tidal wave of emotion so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees, gratitude, awe, and a love so profound it was the very center of his new universe. The royal guards, who had stood frozen in shock, finally moved. They had witnessed a miracle. They had seen Lord Valerius's treachery and Elara's power. Without a word from their king, they seized the sputtering, defeated advisor, dragging him from the room. His political power, built on a foundation of ice and fear, had melted away in an instant. Theron had eyes only for Elara. She was pale, drained by the immense power she had unleashed, but her eyes were shining. He reached up, his hand trembling, and gently cupped her cheek. He felt the softness of her skin, the warmth of her life, and a choked sob escaped him. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotions he was still learning to name. "I love you," she answered, the words simple, true, and absolute. In front of the stunned healers and the few remaining guards, Theron pulled her close. He was no longer a king claiming property. He was a man, raw and reborn, holding his entire world in his arms. "Elara," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound strength and clarity that commanded the attention of everyone present. "For 200 years, this castle, this kingdom, has been cold and silent. You have filled it with light and warmth. You have given me back my soul." He drew back just enough to look her in the eyes. "I will not ask you to be my consort or my concubine. I am asking you to be my wife, my partner, my queen. Rule this kingdom with me. Help me teach it how to feel again." Tears of joy streamed down Elara's face as she nodded, unable to speak. "Yes," she finally managed to whisper. Yes. 3 months later, the citadel was unrecognizable. The black stone walls were now draped in vibrant tapestries of crimson and gold. Sunlight streamed through every window, illuminating floors covered in warm, colorful rugs. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the murmur of a cheerful court, the sound of music in the halls, and the scent of flowers from the gardens that were now miraculously in full bloom. Elara, Queen of the North, stood on a balcony overlooking those gardens. The simple linen shift was long gone, replaced by a gown of deep forest green that brought out the fire in her hair. But the strength in her spine, the quiet confidence in her eyes, was the same. A page approached her, bowing low. "A letter for you, Your Majesty. From the Southern Territories." She took the parchment. The seal was her father's. Her hand was steady as she broke it. The letter was filled with fawning, desperate prose. Her sister, Lyra, had written it, detailing their destitution since the 1,000 gold sovereigns had been spent. She apologized profusely for her past behavior, calling Elara her dearest sister and begging for a position at court, for some small favor from the powerful new queen. Elara read the pathetic, self-serving words without a flicker of emotion. The people who had written this letter were strangers to her now, ghosts from a life that was no longer hers. They had sold her for coin, and now they wanted to claim her for her power. She walked calmly over to the small brazier that warmed the balcony, its cheerful flames a constant comforting presence. Without a second thought, she dropped the letter into the fire. She watched as the parchment curled, blackened, and turned to ash, the insincere words vanishing into smoke and drifting away on the warm breeze. It was the last tie to her past, and she severed it without regret. A pair of strong, warm arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into the solid comfort of her husband's chest. Theron rested his chin on her shoulder, his own warmth a constant and beloved presence. "Bad news?" he asked softly, his voice a gentle rumble against her ear. "No," she said, turning her head to kiss his cheek. "No news at all." He smiled, a genuine, easy expression that still made her heart flutter. He had learned to smile, to laugh, to feel the boundless joy of their life together. His love for her was in every glance, every touch, every breath. Together, they looked out over their kingdom. It was no longer a land of ice and silence, but a realm of burgeoning life and warmth, ruled not by a cold, distant monarch, but by a king and queen whose love had been strong enough to break a curse and usher in the dawn. They had found their home, not in a place, but in each other, and they were finally at peace. Where are you listening from? I love hearing your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more.